Jennifer Matthews stood in the rain outside the mansion she called home for 8 years. Her 3-year-old Triplets clinging to her soaked coat while her husband Brandon and his entire family threw garbage bags filled with her belongings onto the driveway, completely unaware that just 4 hours earlier she had signed the biggest infrastructure contract in state history worth $450 million. But Brandon's mistress, Vanessa, was laughing from the doorway, her hand possessively wrapped around his waist, while his mother, Patricia, sneered that Jennifer was nothing but a worthless burden who couldn't even afford decent clothes for those 3 little accidents. And his sister Melissa filmed the whole humiliating scene for social media, mocking how Jennifer would end up begging on the streets with her triplets because she had no skills, no money, and no future. The contract documents were still in Jennifer's car. The titanium, reinforced vehicle design she'd spent 6 years perfecting in the garage. They'd forbidden her from using the revolutionary blueprint that 7 countries were now fighting to license, the innovation that would rebuild the entire Pacific Northwest transportation infrastructure. But her husband and his family were too busy celebrating her destruction to notice the government officials' Range Rover that had been parked across the street for the past 20 minutes. What would Brandon's face look like when he discovered the woman he'd just thrown away like trash was now the most sought-after engineer in North America? How would Vanessa's laughter sound when she realized the worthless wife she'd replaced was about to become wealthier than Brandon's entire family combined? And what would Patricia and Melissa do when they understood that the woman they just humiliated on camera would soon be deciding whether their family business received the supply contracts that could save them from bankruptcy? Jennifer's hands trembled as she buckled Emma, Olivia, and Sophie into their car seats, her daughter's confused faces breaking her heart into smaller pieces than she thought possible. The rain hammered against the windshield, mixing with tears she refused to let fall until her babies couldn't see. Brandon's voice still echoed in her ears from 30 minutes ago when he'd walked into their bedroom with Vanessa draped on his arm and announced that Jennifer had exactly 1 hour to leave his house. His house, the mansion she'd helped purchase with her grandfather's inheritance before Brandon's tech startup had crashed spectacularly, losing every investor's money and leaving him scrambling to save face in Silicon Valley's ruthless social circles, the home where she'd sacrificed her engineering career to raise their daughters after a complicated pregnancy had left her bedridden for months. The place where his mother, Patricia, had moved in 2 years ago, gradually poisoning every conversation with remarks about Jennifer's inability to lose the baby weight, her failure to maintain proper society connections, her embarrassing habit of sketching vehicle designs on napkins during family dinners. Jennifer had watched her husband transform from the ambitious entrepreneur she'd married into a hollow man who measured his worth by his mother's approval ratings and his mistress's Instagram followers. Vanessa worked at his mother's real estate firm, a 26-year-old with perfect highlights and a talent for making Jennifer feel invisible in her own home. The affair had been obvious for 8 months, but Jennifer had stayed silent, focusing instead on the project that consumed her nights after the triplets finally slept. The garage had become her sanctuary, the place where she'd rebuilt herself bolt by bolt. Her background in aerospace, engineering, and material science had seemed like a waste during those years of changing diapers and attending playdates, but every skill had been sharpening in the darkness, waiting for the right application. The titanium, reinforced chassis design had started as a sketch on the back of Sophie's pediatrician bill, an innovation that could revolutionize how cities approach public transportation infrastructure in earthquake zones. She'd submitted the preliminary designs to the Department of Transportation 18 months ago under her maiden name, Bennett, never mentioning it to Brandon because his last 3 business ventures had imploded after he'd overpromised and underdealt to investors who'd expected miracles. This was hers, something he couldn't touch or diminish or claim credit for during cocktail parties where he rewrote history to make his failures sound like strategic pivots. The government response had been immediate and enthusiastic. Jennifer had spent the past year and a half in clandestine meetings with federal engineers, transportation secretaries, and military advisors who understood that her design wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary. The titanium composite framework could withstand seismic activity that would crumble traditional infrastructure, while the modular construction system reduced building time by 60% and cost by 40% compared to current methods. 3 countries had contacted her within weeks of her presenting to the International Engineering Summit last fall. Japan wanted her designs for their coastal cities. New Zealand needed earthquake resistant solutions for Wellington's transportation overhaul. Chile's government had sent a delegation to her hotel room with contracts that made her head spin. But the United States had ultimately won the bidding war, offering her the Pacific Northwest Infrastructure Modernization Project, a contract worth $450 million over 8 years, with her firm taking the lead design and oversight role. She'd signed the final documents that morning in a Seattle conference room surrounded by senators, military, generals, and the governor himself. The champagne had been expensive, the handshakes firm, the future impossibly bright. Jennifer Bennett Matthews was now the principal engineer and project director for the largest infrastructure overhaul in West Coast history. The contract specified that her company, Bennett Engineering Solutions, established just 6 weeks ago with paperwork filed under her maiden name, would receive an immediate advanced payment of $45 million to establish headquarters and begin hiring the team of specialists the project required. The wire transfer would hit her new business account within 72 hours. Jennifer had driven home from Seattle with her phone exploding with congratulatory messages from colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years, job applications from engineers who wanted to work under her leadership, and interview requests from networks that wanted to feature the woman who designed the future. She'd imagined telling Brandon over a quiet dinner, watching his face transform with pride, perhaps finally earning Patricia's grudging respect for accomplishing something substantial. Instead, she'd walked into her bedroom to find Vanessa modeling lingerie she bought with Brandon's credit card while his sister Melissa filmed reaction videos for her social media followers. Patricia had been sitting on Jennifer's bed, casually explaining that Brandon had finally found a real woman who understood how to support a man's ambitions, unlike Jennifer, who let herself go and wasted her education playing housewife to 3 demanding children. Brandon had barely looked at Jennifer when he delivered his prepared speech. The marriage was over, had been over for years if she was honest with herself. Vanessa made him feel alive again, made him remember who he was before. Responsibilities and screaming babies had drained his potential. Patricia's real estate firm had a position waiting for him, a fresh start where he could rebuild his reputation. Jennifer could have the car and whatever clothes fit in garbage bags, but everything else belonged to him because his name was on the mortgage documents. Melissa had laughed when Jennifer asked about the triplets, suggesting that maybe this was the universe's way of teaching Jennifer that some women weren't meant to be mothers and career women simultaneously. Vanessa had added that the girls would probably benefit from a father who wasn't constantly exhausted from a wife's emotional demands, that maybe Brandon could actually focus on his daughters. Once Jennifer's negative energy was removed from the equation, Jennifer had packed in silence, her mind calculating trajectories and consequences, while her hands folded tiny clothes and gathered favorite stuffed animals. She'd taken the contract documents from her car's glove compartment and hidden them inside Emma's diaper bag, knowing that Brandon never touched anything related to childcare. She'd watched Patricia supervise the garbage bag packing, making sure Jennifer didn't steal any valuable jewelry or artwork that had been Patterson family heirlooms. The cruelty had been methodical and complete, designed to break her spirit and ensure she understood her worthlessness in their hierarchy. Melissa's phone had captured every moment, every tear Jennifer had fought to suppress, every humiliating second of her standing in the rain, while Vanessa laughed about how the mighty had fallen. But none of them had noticed the government vehicle parked across the street, the dark Range Rover with federal plates and tinted windows. None of them had recognized Deputy Director Morrison from the Department of Transportation, who'd insisted on providing security for his newest contractor, given the sensitive nature of the project and the international attention it would attract. None of them understood that the bedraggled woman they were destroying on camera was now more valuable to national infrastructure than their entire social circle combined. Jennifer started the car, her titanium-reinforced vehicle prototype that she'd been testing for 6 months, without Brandon noticing anything unusual about the sedan he dismissed as her boring mom car. The engine purred with power that defied its modest exterior, the chassis absorbing the road's imperfections with technology that would soon revolutionize transportation worldwide. She pulled away from the mansion, slowly watching it disappear in her rear-view mirror while her daughters sang nursery rhymes in the back seat, blissfully unaware that their world had just shattered and rebuilt itself in the same breath. The hotel suite she'd reserved that morning overlooked Puget Sound, a temporary home while she searched for the right property to establish both Bennett engineering solutions headquarters, and a real home for her daughters. The $45 million advance would cover everything, from hiring the industry's best engineers to creating the childcare facilities she'd need for Emma, Olivia, and Sophie during the intense work years ahead. Her phone vibrated with another message from Deputy Director Morrison, confirming that tomorrow's press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The governor wanted to personally announce the contract award, emphasizing the administration's commitment to infrastructure innovation and highlighting Jennifer's groundbreaking work. Networks were already requesting interviews. Engineering journals wanted exclusive features. Universities were offering research partnerships and guest lecture opportunities. Brandon's world was about to implode in ways as limited imagination couldn't begin to comprehend. Patricia's real estate firm was already struggling, hemorrhaging clients to newer agencies with better technology and more aggressive marketing. The company desperately needed the commercial supply contracts that came with major government infrastructure projects, the relationships that could transform a dying business into a regional powerhouse. Those contracts were now Jennifer's to award or withhold, her decisions determining which suppliers would profit from 8 years of continuous construction work across 6 states. Melissa's social media empire was built on lifestyle content and family connections, her followers believing she had insider access to Seattle's elite business circles. The video she just posted of Jennifer's humiliation would become Melissa's nightmare within days. The permanent evidence of how the Patterson family had treated the engineer who'd become Washington State's most valuable infrastructure asset. Vanessa would discover that the worthless wife she'd replaced had been worth more than Brandon's entire failed career. That the woman she'd mocked for sketching designs at family dinners had been creating the innovation that 7 countries wanted to license. Brandon would understand too late that he'd discarded a partner worth hundreds of millions for a mistress whose primary skill was social media photography and a mother whose approval meant nothing in the world of engineering excellence. Jennifer tucked the triplets into the hotel suite's king-size bed. Their small bodies finally relaxed after the chaos of the evening. Emma clutched her stuffed elephant. Olivia had found her thumb, and Sophie was already snoring softly. They would adapt and thrive because children were resilient, and Jennifer would make absolutely certain they grew up understanding their worth had nothing to do with other people's limited vision. Tomorrow's press conference would destroy Brandon's world systematically and completely. But tonight, Jennifer allowed herself to feel everything. The grief and rage and satisfaction mixing into something she didn't have words for yet. Something that tasted like justice and felt like freedom and looked like the future she'd built in secret. While they called her worthless, Brandon Patterson woke up to 73 missed calls and his phone vibrating so aggressively it had fallen off the nightstand. Vanessa stirred beside him, her blonde hair spread across the pillow. That had been Jennifer's for 8 years, her perfectly manicured hand reaching for his chest with the possessiveness of victory. His mother's voice was shrieking from the hallway before he could check the notifications. Patricia's fury, so palpable it seemed to shake the mansion's foundation. The first message was from his former business partner from the failed tech startup, the man who'd sworn never to speak to Brandon again after the investor disaster. The text was simple and devastating. "Dude, did you seriously just kick out Jennifer Bennett? The Jennifer Bennett? Are you completely insane?" Brandon's confusion lasted exactly 4 more seconds until he opened the news alert that had crashed his phone's notification system. The Seattle Times headline dominated his screen with a photograph that made his stomach drop into place. His stomachs shouldn't reach. Jennifer standing between the governor and 3 military generals, her hands shaking the Secretary of Transportation's grip, her smile confident and radiant, her eyes sparkling with achievement. Local engineer Jennifer Bennett awarded $450 million Pacific Northwest infrastructure contract, revolutionary titanium design to transform regional transportation. The article detailed everything. 6 years of secret development work, international bidding wars, 7 countries competing for licensing rights, a preliminary advance payment of $45 million. Bennett Engineering Solutions established 6 weeks ago with headquarters soon to be announced in the Seattle metropolitan area. The project would create 8,000 jobs over 8 years, revolutionize earthquake-resistant infrastructure design, and position the Pacific Northwest as the global leader in next-generation transportation innovation. There were quotes from engineering professors who taught Jennifer at MIT, colleagues who'd recognized her genius before she disappeared into marriage and motherhood, government officials praising her meticulous attention to safety standards and cost efficiency. The governor had used words like visionary and transformational and the future of American infrastructure innovation. The photographs showed Jennifer in a tailored navy suit that Brandon had never seen. Her hairstyle professionally, her posture radiating authority and competence. She looked like someone who'd been hiding in plain sight, someone who'd been extraordinary all along, while he'd been too blind and stupid to notice. This wasn't the exhausted woman he'd mocked for sketching on napkins. This was Jennifer Bennett, the engineer whose designs were about to change how cities approach transportation infrastructure in seismically active regions. Brandon's hands shook as he scrolled through more articles. Forbes was already calculating her potential net worth, estimating that licensing deals alone could push her into billionaire territory within 5 years. The Wall Street Journal had published a profile of her journey from aerospace engineering to infrastructure innovation. Engineering Weekly had interviewed former professors who'd predicted Jennifer would revolutionize the field if she ever returned to it full-time. Vanessa had woken up now, her confusion transforming into horror as she read over his shoulder. Patricia burst into the bedroom without knocking, her face twisted with rage and panic, her phone showing the same headlines that were destroying Brandon's understanding of reality. Melissa was crying in the hallway, her social media notifications exploding with comments about the video she'd posted last night. Thousands of people calling her cruel and short-sighted and asking how she could humiliate an engineering genius on camera. "Fix this," Patricia hissed, her voice venomous with desperation. "Call her, apologize, tell her it was a mistake, that you were stressed, that we didn't mean any of it. Brandon, my company needs those supply contracts. The infrastructure project will require commercial real estate services, construction supply chains, logistics, coordination. If Jennifer blacklists us, we're finished. Do you understand? Finished." Brandon tried calling Jennifer's number. It went straight to an automated message informing him that this number was no longer in service. He tried her email, only to discover she'd changed her address to something associated with Bennett Engineering Solutions. He checked social media accounts that no longer existed, realizing Jennifer had systematically erased every connection to her married identity. His sister Melissa had deleted the humiliation video, but it was too late. Screenshots and recordings had spread across multiple platforms picked up by news outlets covering the contract story. The comments were brutal and specific. People were identifying Patricia's real estate firm, calling for boycotts and investigation into how the Patterson family treated women. Melissa's sponsors were dropping her. Brands distancing themselves from someone who'd filmed cruelty toward a woman now celebrated as an infrastructure hero. The doorbell rang at 7:30, a sound that made Brandon's blood freeze. Deputy Director Morrison stood on the porch with 2 federal agents there, expressions professionally neutral, but their purpose unmistakable. Morrison held a tablet showing the video Melissa had posted, the footage of Jennifer standing in the rain with her triplets, while Vanessa laughed and Patricia sneered. "Mr. Patterson," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "I'm here in an unofficial capacity this morning to inform you that Dr. Bennett has requested a restraining order preventing any member of your family from contacting her or her daughters. Given the sensitive nature of her current government contracts and the security clearances involved, this request will be granted immediately. Any attempt to contact Dr. Bennett will be considered a federal violation." Brandon tried to speak, but Morrison held up a hand. "I watched that video last night from across the street. Mr. Patterson, I watched you and your family humiliate one of the most brilliant engineers I've encountered in 30 years of government service. Dr. Bennett specifically requested that I deliver this message personally. She has no interest in revenge because success is the best response to cruelty, but she wants you to understand that the life you threw away last night was worth more than you'll ever achieve." Morrison turned to Patricia, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Bennett has also instructed all project contractors to exclude Patterson Real Estate from any consideration for supply chain partnerships or commercial service agreements associated with the Pacific Northwest Infrastructure Project. This decision is final and non-negotiable. Good morning." The federal agents left their departure, creating a vacuum of silence so complete that Brandon could hear his mother's breathing sharp and panicked. Vanessa had retreated to the bathroom. Her earlier confidence evaporated into the recognition that she'd helped destroy something irreplaceable for a relationship that now felt hollow and temporary. Brandon walked through the house in a daze, seeing it with new eyes. The garage he'd forbidden Jennifer from using had been her workshop, he realized now. The napkin sketches he'd mocked had been preliminary designs for innovations worth hundreds of millions. The late nights he complained about had been Jennifer teaching herself advanced materials, science, and seismic engineering. While he'd scrolled through social media, feeling sorry for himself, his phone continued erupting with messages from people he'd lost contact with over the years. Former colleagues from the failed startup were asking if he was the same Brandon Patterson who just divorced Jennifer Bennett. Investors he'd burned were pointing out the irony that he'd been married to someone actually capable of delivering revolutionary innovation while claiming to be a visionary himself. Friends from college wanted to know if the rumors were true, if he'd really kicked out the triplets in the rain, if he'd actually chosen his mother's approval and a mistress over a wife who'd been secretly building the future. The headlines kept coming throughout the morning. International engineering consortiums were announcing licensing partnerships with Bennett Engineering Solutions. 3 universities were offering Jennifer endowed professorships and research facilities. The governor had scheduled a second press conference to announce that Washington state was providing tax incentives to ensure Bennett Engineering Solutions headquarters remained in Seattle, creating a new hub for infrastructure innovation that would attract talent and investment for decades. By afternoon, Brandon understood the full scope of what he destroyed. The wife he called worthless was now worth more than his entire family's combined assets. The mother he dismissed as failing at parenthood was successfully raising 3 daughters while simultaneously revolutionizing infrastructure engineering. The woman he'd humiliated on camera was now being celebrated globally as a visionary whose work would literally reshape how cities were built. Patricia's real estate firm had lost 6 major clients by noon, companies unwilling to associate with a family that had treated Jennifer Bennett with such visible cruelty. Melissa had lost her primary sponsors and watched her follower count drop by 30,000 as people shared the video alongside articles about Jennifer's achievements. Vanessa had gone home to her apartment, suddenly uncomfortable living in a house Jennifer had helped purchase, suddenly aware that she'd become the other woman in a story where she was undeniably the villain. Brandon sat in the garage that evening, staring at the workbench where Jennifer had obviously spent countless hours. There were still pencil marks on the concrete floor, equations and diagrams that made no sense to him but clearly represented years of dedicated effort. He found a folder hidden behind old paint cans filled with rejection letters from investors who dismissed her designs as too ambitious, encouragement notes she'd written to herself, photographs of the triplets that she'd apparently looked at for motivation during difficult nights. One photograph stopped him cold. Jennifer was in this garage surrounded by design papers and engineering textbooks. Her laptop opened to complex modeling software. She looked exhausted and determined and absolutely certain of her path. The photo was dated 8 months ago, right around the time his affair with Vanessa had begun, right around the time he decided Jennifer was no longer worth his attention. She'd been building the future while he'd been destroying the present. She'd been working towards something revolutionary while he'd been working toward nothing but his mother's approval. She'd been sacrificing sleep and comfort to create innovations that would benefit millions, while he'd been complaining that she didn't pay enough attention to his needs. The titanium reinforced vehicle she'd driven away and suddenly made sense. She'd been testing her own designs, perfecting her innovations, using her daily life as the laboratory. The boring mom car he'd mocked had been a prototype for technology that would transform transportation infrastructure worldwide. Jennifer had been extraordinary all along, and he'd been too small-minded to see it. His phone buzzed with one final message, this one from a reporter asking if he wanted to comment on his ex-wife's success. Brandon stared at the question, understanding that any response he gave would be inadequate and self-serving. What could he possibly say? That he'd been wrong. That he'd confused quietness with worthlessness. That he'd mistaken sacrifice for failure? The truth was simpler and more devastating. Jennifer had been playing chess while he'd been playing checkers, building an empire while he'd been building nothing, becoming someone extraordinary while he'd been becoming someone forgettable. And he'd thrown her away like garbage, never suspecting that he was discarding the only genuinely valuable thing in his entire life. Jennifer stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office, watching construction crews break ground on Bennett Engineering Solutions headquarters. The building would be a showcase for her innovations, featuring the titanium-reinforced design elements that had won her the government contract, earthquake-resistant technology that would make it one of the safest structures in the Pacific Northwest. The architectural firm had proposed something traditional, but Jennifer had insisted on creating something that demonstrated her vision for the future of urban construction. 3 weeks had passed since that rainy night outside Brandon's mansion. 3 weeks that had transformed her existence so completely that her old life felt like someone else's story. The triplets were thriving in their new home, a sprawling property in Bellevue with enough space for them to run and play without bothering anyone. She'd hired 2 nannies who specialized in early childhood development, women who treated her daughters with genuine affection, rather than the barely concealed irritation Patricia had always shown. Emma, Olivia, and Sophie were adjusting remarkably well to their new circumstances. They asked about their father occasionally, but Jennifer had explained gently that sometimes families change shape, and that was okay because love didn't disappear just because living situations shifted. The court-ordered restraining order ensured Brandon couldn't disrupt their stability with inconsistent parenting or confusing messages about where they belonged. The preliminary team Jennifer had assembled for the infrastructure project read like a dream roster of engineering talent. She recruited specialists from MIT, Stanford, and Caltech, offering salaries and research budgets that made academic positions look like charity work. The government advance had allowed her to be aggressive in talent acquisition, and engineers who'd been languishing in corporate positions were jumping at the opportunity to work on innovations that would actually matter. Dr. Patricia Kim had been her first hire, a material science expert who'd been stuck teaching undergraduate classes despite publishing groundbreaking research on composite structures. Dr. Robert Chong had abandoned a consulting career that paid ridiculous money but provided zero intellectual satisfaction to join Jennifer's team as lead structural engineer. The roster continued growing daily. Brilliant minds who understood that Bennett Engineering Solutions wasn't just another firm, but rather a chance to reshape infrastructure design fundamentally. The licensing deals had exceeded even Jennifer's optimistic projections. Japan had signed a 20-year agreement worth $80 million for rights to implement her seismic-resistant designs in Tokyo's transportation expansion. New Zealand had committed $50 million for the Wellington project. Chile, Peru, and Ecuador had formed a South American consortium offering $90 million for comprehensive licensing across the Pacific coastal regions. The intellectual property alone was generating wealth that would fund research and development for decades. Forbes had published their profile last week featuring Jennifer on the cover, with a headline that made her laugh. The engineer they underestimated how Jennifer Bennett built an infrastructure empire while her husband looked elsewhere. The article had been fair and thorough, interviewing colleagues who'd known her at MIT, professors who'd recognized her potential, and government officials who championed her contract bid. There had been tasteful mention of her divorce in the viral video, but the focus had remained firmly on her achievements rather than her personal drama. The interview requests had been overwhelming. Good Morning America wanted her for a full segment. 60 Minutes was proposing a profile on women in engineering who'd overcome adversity to achieve breakthrough success. TED had invited her to deliver a talk at their next conference about innovation born from necessity. Jennifer had accepted, selectively understanding that media presence was part of building Bennett Engineering Solutions' brand recognition, but also aware that her primary obligation was to the work itself. Her phone buzzed with a message from Deputy Director Morrison, confirming that tomorrow's site inspection in Portland would include senators from Oregon and Washington who wanted to understand the project scope. Jennifer appreciated Morrison's steady presence throughout these chaotic weeks, his matter-of-fact approach to security concerns and political considerations. He'd become an unexpected ally, someone who understood that Jennifer's primary interest was engineering excellence rather than bureaucratic posturing. The triplets burst into her office at 6 o'clock there, nannies apologizing for the intrusion, but Jennifer waving them off with a laugh. Emma had drawn a picture of their new house, complete with the engineering-themed playground Jennifer had commissioned for the backyard. Olivia wanted to show off her counting skills, racing through numbers while her sisters cheered. Sophie had questions about the construction equipment outside, her 3-year-old curiosity already gravitating toward the machines and structures that shape the world. Jennifer gathered her daughters close, breathing in their shampooed hair and feeling gratitude, so intense it bordered on painful. These babies were the reason she'd persevered through those years of diminishment and dismissal. They were why she stayed up late perfecting designs instead of confronting Brandon about his obvious affair. They were the motivation behind every equation she'd solved and every innovation she'd tested. Brandon had tried contacting her through intermediaries twice in the past 3 weeks. Messages that Jennifer had ignored systematically and completely. His mother, Patricia, had sent a letter that Jennifer's lawyer had returned unopened. Understanding that nothing the Patterson family had to say would be worth the emotional energy required to process it, Melissa had attempted a public apology via social media, a transparent attempt to salvage her influencer career that had been met with mockery and disbelief. Vanessa had apparently moved out of the mansion, according to reports Jennifer had heard secondhand through mutual acquaintances. The relationship between Brandon and his mistress had predictably deteriorated once the excitement of forbidden romance had faded into the reality of everyday existence. Jennifer felt no satisfaction from this news, only a distant recognition that temporary attractions rarely survived exposure to real life. The press conference where the governor announced her contract had been Jennifer's moment of complete vindication. But she discovered something interesting about revenge in the aftermath. The satisfaction was fleeting and hollow compared to the genuine fulfillment of doing work she loved with people who respected her abilities. Watching Brandon's world crumble had been briefly gratifying, but building her own empire was infinitely more rewarding. Her legal team had been thorough about protecting her interests and her daughter's futures. The divorce settlement had been surprisingly straightforward once Brandon's lawyers understood they had no leverage and significant liability exposure. Jennifer had kept her inheritance, her vehicle prototype, and her intellectual property. Brandon had kept the mansion with its mortgage and memories. The child support agreement was generous but firm, with strict visitation schedules that prevented him from disrupting the triplets' stability. Jennifer's personal wealth had crossed into territory she'd never imagined during those years of changing diapers and attending playdates. The contract payments, licensing deals, and equity in Bennett Engineering Solutions combined to create a net worth that financial advisors kept revising upward. She'd established trust funds for Emma, Olivia, and Sophie that would guarantee their educations and opportunities, regardless of what happened in the future. But money had never been Jennifer's primary motivator. Despite what Brandon and his family had apparently believed, the work itself was what drove her. The satisfaction of solving complex problems that had stumped other engineers. The thrill of seeing her designs transform from sketches into structures that would serve communities for generations. The infrastructure project would be her legacy, physical proof that innovation could come from unexpected places and that determination could overcome dismissal. The titanium reinforced chassis design was already being studied by engineering programs worldwide. Jennifer's methodology becoming required reading in graduate-level courses focused on seismic-resistant construction. She'd been invited to lecture at MIT next semester, returning to her alma mater as a visiting professor who'd proven that maternal sacrifice and professional achievement weren't mutually exclusive categories. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. The Portland site inspection would be followed by meetings with transportation officials from California and British Columbia, both interested in expanding the project scope beyond the original 6 SD state parameters. Jennifer's team had prepared comprehensive presentations, demonstrating how the design could be adapted for different geographical and seismic conditions without compromising structural integrity. But tonight belonged to her daughters, to the bedtime routine that grounded Jennifer. No matter how chaotic her professional life became, she read them stories about brave women who changed the world through determination and creativity, carefully selected books that emphasized intelligence and perseverance over appearance and compliance. Emma, Olivia, and Sophie would grow up understanding that their worth was intrinsic and that other people's limited vision was never their problem. Jennifer tucked them in one by one, kissing foreheads and adjusting blankets, and promising that tomorrow they'd visit the Children's Museum before her afternoon meetings. Their room in the Bellevue house was filled with natural light and educational toys, a space designed to nurture their curiosity rather than contain their energy. They were safe and loved and valued, everything Jennifer had needed to ensure before she could fully embrace her professional success. She returned to her home office, afterward reviewing design modifications for the Seattle transportation hub that would serve as the project showcase. The blueprints spread across her desk represented thousands of hours of work, countless revisions and improvements, the accumulated expertise of Jennifer's entire career distilled into innovations that would literally change how cities approach infrastructure in seismically active regions. Her phone showed text messages from team members sharing excitement about tomorrow's presentations. Engineers who understood they were participating in something historically significant. Jennifer responded to each one thoughtfully, building the collaborative culture that would define Bennett Engineering Solutions for years to come. She'd learned from Brandon's failed startup that technical innovation meant nothing without team cohesion and mutual respect. The video of her humiliation had disappeared from most platforms, deleted by Melissa and removed by moderators responding to copyright claims and harassment concerns. But Jennifer had saved a copy on an encrypted drive, not for revenge, but as a reminder of where she'd come from and how far she'd traveled. On difficult days, she'd watch those 30 seconds of rain and garbage bags in Vanessa's laughter, letting the memory fuel her determination to prove that cruelty was temporary, but achievement was permanent. Brandon would live with his choices forever, understanding too late that he'd traded substance for appearance and excellence for mediocrity. Patricia would watch her real estate firm struggle without the infrastructure contracts that could have saved it, knowing she prioritized status over recognizing genuine worth. Melissa would rebuild her social media presence eventually, but always with the shadow of that video haunting her engagement metrics. Vanessa would move forward with the recognition that she'd been part of destroying something valuable for something temporary. Jennifer felt no anger toward any of them anymore, only a distant pity for people who'd confused quietness with weakness and sacrifice with failure. They'd given her the greatest gift possible. Even though they'd intended cruelty, they forced her to rebuild herself into someone stronger and more capable than she'd ever been while trying to please them. The future stretched ahead with opportunities that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks ago. International partnerships were forming. Research grants were being offered. Speaking invitations were accumulating from organizations that understood Jennifer represented something larger than just engineering achievement. She was proof that women could disappear into motherhood and marriage without losing the essence of who they were. That dormant skills could reawaken when given the right opportunity. That dismissal from small-minded people meant absolutely nothing in the larger context of capability and determination. 6 months later, Brandon stood outside the construction site where Jennifer's innovations were transforming downtown Seattle's transportation infrastructure. The titanium-reinforced framework rose against the skyline like a monument to everything he'd failed to see in his wife. Each beam and girder representing technology he dismissed as napkin sketches and garage hobbies. Workers moved with purpose across the site, their hard hats bearing the Bennett Engineering Solutions logo that was rapidly becoming synonymous with revolutionary infrastructure design. He'd come here without really understanding why, drawn by some masochistic need to witness what he'd lost. Jennifer's success had become impossible to avoid. Even when Brandon tried to ignore it, her face appeared regularly in business publications and engineering journals. Her company was hiring aggressively, offering opportunities that made talented engineers abandon established careers. The Bennett name was becoming legendary in infrastructure circles, while the Patterson name was becoming a cautionary tale about underestimating the people closest to you. The mansion he'd kept in the divorce was hemorrhaging value. Its association with a viral video, making it toxic to potential buyers. Patricia's real estate firm had been forced to merge with a competitor after losing too many clients who wanted no connection to the family that had humiliated an engineering genius on camera. Melissa had abandoned social media entirely, taking a corporate communications position that paid a fraction of what her influencer career had generated during its peak. Vanessa had disappeared from his life 3 months ago, their relationship disintegrating once the excitement of forbidden romance had faded into the banality of everyday existence. She'd returned the expensive jewelry he'd bought during their affair, her note explaining that she couldn't live with herself, knowing she participated in destroying a family. Brandon had read that note 17 times, searching for absolution that didn't exist within its careful sentences. His attempts to see Emma, Olivia, and Sophie had been limited to supervised visitation in locations where court-appointed monitors ensured he didn't attempt to poison his daughters against their mother. The triplets were polite but distant during these visits, their questions about his life peremptory, their attention wandering toward activities that didn't involve him. They talked constantly about their new house, in their new school, in the engineering toys their mother bought them that turned physics into play. Jennifer had ensured the girls knew they were loved, that their father's absence was about his choices rather than their worth. She'd apparently never spoken negatively about Brandon in their presence, a grace he didn't deserve and couldn't reciprocate because he had nothing positive to say about his own decisions. The girls were thriving, according to reports from their teachers and pediatrician, adjusted and happy and secure in ways they'd never been during those chaotic years in the mansion. Brandon's mother had stopped speaking to him entirely after the financial implications of their treatment of Jennifer had become undeniable. Patricia blamed Brandon for not controlling his wife better, for not recognizing her potential and either supporting it or suppressing it before it could threaten the family's social standing. The logic was twisted and self-serving, but that was Patricia's specialty, rewriting reality to avoid accepting responsibility for her own cruelty. Professional opportunities had evaporated once Brandon's connection to Jennifer's story became widely known. The tech community was small and gossipy, and everyone now understood that Brandon Patterson was the man who'd thrown away a brilliant engineer for his mother's approval and a younger woman's attention. Investors who'd considered funding his new startup ideas had withdrawn after discovering his identity. Colleagues who'd been willing to collaborate suddenly had scheduling conflicts that lasted indefinitely. He'd finally gotten a job 3 weeks ago, a mid-level position at a software company, where nobody knew his history and his unremarkable skills were sufficient for unremarkable work. The salary covered his mortgage and basic expenses, but provided none of the lifestyle he'd convinced himself he deserved. Brandon ate lunch alone in his cubicle, afraid that conversation with coworkers would eventually reveal who he was and what he'd done. The construction site foreman noticed Brandon standing at the fence, his suspicion obvious, even at a distance. Security had probably been briefed about Jennifer's ex-husband, warned that he might attempt contact or disruption. Brandon raised his hands in a gesture of peace and backed away, understanding that he no longer had any place in Jennifer's world, not even as a spectator to her achievements. He drafted apology letters that he'd never sent, knowing that no combination of words could undo the cruelty of that rainy night or erase the years of dismissal that had preceded it. Jennifer had made it clear through her lawyers that she had no interest in communication that didn't pertain to the triplets' welfare and education. She'd moved forward completely, building a life so full and purposeful that his absence probably registered as relief rather than loss. Sometimes Brandon let himself imagine alternative timelines where he'd supported Jennifer's engineering work instead of mocking it, where he'd recognized her sacrifice instead of resenting her exhaustion, where he'd chosen his family over his mother's approval. In those imaginary scenarios, he was the husband celebrating beside Jennifer at press conferences, the father proudly telling strangers that his wife had revolutionized infrastructure design, the partner who'd been smart enough to recognize extraordinary when it was sleeping beside him every night. But those timelines existed only in Brandon's regretful imagination, alternative realities that couldn't compete with the actual history he'd created through his choices. He'd prioritized all the wrong things and lost everything that actually mattered. Jennifer had survived his cruelty and transformed it into fuel for achievement that would outlast his entire existence. She'd proven that the people who dismiss you are never the ones who determine your worth. That talent combined with determination could overcome even the most complete forms of betrayal. Brandon walked back to his modest apartment in a building with thin walls and cheaper rent, passing homeless people who might have been him if Jennifer hadn't been generous in the divorce settlement. She could have destroyed him financially and legally if she'd wanted revenge, but instead she'd simply moved forward as though he'd never mattered enough to waste energy punishing. That indifference hurt worse than active hatred would have. The recognition that he'd become irrelevant to the woman he tried to make feel worthless. His phone contained no messages because there was nobody left who wanted to talk to him. His mother was done. His sister was ashamed. His ex-girlfriend wanted nothing to do with him, and his former friends had discovered they'd never really liked him. That much anyway. The isolation was complete and self-inflicted, consequences that Brandon had earned through decisions he couldn't undo, no matter how desperately he wished otherwise. The news that evening featured a segment on Jennifer's upcoming TED Talk about innovation and perseverance, promotional footage showing her confident presence on the famous Red Circle. The interviewer asked about her divorce in the viral video, giving Jennifer the opportunity to discuss how cruelty had motivated her success. But Jennifer had simply smiled and redirected the conversation toward her team's achievements and the infrastructure project's potential impact on communities worldwide. "I don't spend much time thinking about the past," Jennifer had said, her voice warm and genuine. My daughters and my work are what matter now. Everything else is just noise that doesn't deserve my attention or energy. Success really is the best response to people who underestimate you. Not because it hurts them, but because it proves they were never important enough to slow you down. Brandon watched that interview 3 times, trying to read between the lines for some hint of residual feeling, some indication that Jennifer remembered him as anything other than an obstacle she'd overcome. But there was nothing. No bitterness or anger or longing. Just the complete indifference of someone who'd moved so far forward that looking back required more effort than it was worth. The truth he'd been avoiding crystallized in that moment. Jennifer hadn't just survived his betrayal, she'd transcended it entirely. She built a life so fulfilling and purposeful that his presence or absence made no meaningful difference. She was raising their daughters with love and teaching them to value substance over appearance. She was changing how cities approached infrastructure in earthquake zones. She was mentoring young engineers and breaking down barriers for women in male-dominated fields. She was making a difference that would echo through generations. And Brandon was eating microwave dinners alone in a small apartment, working a job that bored him, living a life defined entirely by the moment he'd been too stupid to recognize what he had until it was walking away in the rain with garbage bags and 3 confused little girls. He'd become exactly what he'd accused Jennifer of being: worthless, purposeless, invisible. To people who mattered, the story that had started with his cruelty had ended with his irrelevance, and there was nothing left to do but live with